Most people think the First World War began with a single gunshot in Sarajevo. One wrong turn, one assassin, one tragic mistake. But what if I told you that by the time that trigger was pulled, Europe had already been preparing for war for 44 years? That long before 1914, the continent was quietly arming itself, dividing itself, hardening itself, like a machine being built piece by piece, waiting for someone to switch it on. Imagine a Europe where every nation feels threatened. France humiliated and burning for revenge. Germany rising too fast, too powerful, too confident. Britain watching the seas, counting ships, wondering who will challenge its empire. Russia dreaming of protecting the Slavs. Austria-Hungary, afraid it might fall apart from within. Alliances signed in secret rooms. War plans drawn up in ink, so rigid they leave no room for hesitation. Timetables measured down to the hour. Generals who believe delay means defeat. Politicians who believe backing down means humiliation. Now imagine a world where every crisis, in Morocco, in the Balkans, in Africa, ends not with relief, but with deeper suspicion, where each peace only convinces nations they must prepare harder for the next confrontation, where young men are taught that war is glorious, necessary, inevitable, where newspapers scream about enemies, where dreadnoughts slide into the water like steel promises of future destruction. By 1914, Europe isn't calm. It's tense, wired, waiting. And when the shots finally echo across Sarajevo, it doesn't feel like the beginning of something new. It feels like the release of pressure that has been building for decades. This is not the story of how World War I started. This is the story of how Europe made it unavoidable. Chapter 1, 1870, the war that reshaped Europe. The telegram was never meant to start a world war. It was only a few clipped sentences, carefully edited, deliberately sharpened. But when it was printed in newspapers across Europe, it ignited something far more dangerous than anyone in Paris or Berlin could control. In crowded cafes, men leaned over ink-stained pages, voices rising. In royal courts, diplomats stiffened. In barracks yards, boots struck cobblestone with new urgency. No one yet knew that this insult, this calculated humiliation, would help set Europe on a path that would not end for 44 years. The crisis began in the summer heat of 1870. The air in Europe was thick, heavy with suspicion. For decades, the German states had existed as fragments. Prussia in the north, Bavaria in the south, dozens of smaller kingdoms and duchies stitched loosely together by language but divided by politics. And standing across the Rhine was France, still carrying the aura of Napoleonic grandeur, still believing itself the natural guardian of continental balance. But balance is a fragile thing. At the center of this gathering storm stood a man who understood that wars are not always won on battlefields first. They are won in perception. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Prussia, knew that German unity required an external enemy. He needed the southern German states, cautious, Catholic, wary of Prussian dominance, to feel threatened enough to rally behind Berlin. France would provide that threat. When a distant Spanish succession dispute placed a Prussian prince in line for the Spanish throne, France protested fiercely. It feared encirclement. It feared a strengthened Prussia. Bismarck encouraged those fears. He edited a diplomatic telegram, the EMS dispatch, trimming it so that it read as an insult to French honor. It was a spark tossed in a dry grass. Paris erupted. Crowds gathered beneath balconies shouting for war. Newspapers demanded action. The smell of hot ink mixed with tobacco smoke as editors rushed to print special editions. National pride had been wounded. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia, believing it would be a swift, decisive campaign that would reassert French dominance. Instead, it walked into a trap. Prussia did not stand alone. Behind it stood the machinery of modern organization. Railways mapped like veins across German soil, mobilization timetables calculated down to the hour, reserves trained and ready. If war planning is like setting dominoes in place, Prussia had arranged every piece with cold precision. When France declared war, those dominoes began to fall. Across the German states, church bells rang. Young men embraced mothers, wives, sweethearts. Steam engines screamed as trains carried soldiers westward. The smell of coal smoke and iron filled the air. Uniforms brushed against rough wooden benches. Fear and excitement mingled in equal measure. France mobilized too, but its preparations were slower, more chaotic. Commanders relied on assumptions rooted in past glories. They expected momentum, bold charges, patriotic fervor to compensate for logistical gaps. They underestimated the speed and coordination of their opponent. Within weeks, the difference became brutally clear. At the battles of Wissembourg, Spicheren, and Worth, French forces were driven back. The thunder of Krupp artillery, steel breech-loading cannons that fired faster and more accurately than many French guns, echoed across rolling hills. The ground shook. Smoke drifted low over fields trampled by infantry boots. Soldiers coughed, eyes burning from powder. Orders were shouted, swallowed by cannon blasts. The war moved swiftly toward catastrophe for France. By early September, at the Battle of Sedan, the French army found itself encircled. Encirclement in warfare is simple to imagine, like a tightening fist around a struggling object, squeezing from all sides. Prussian and German forces closed in, cutting off escape. Shells rained down. Horses screamed. Men huddled in shallow trenches, feeling the earth tremble beneath them. Inside Sedan, Emperor Napoleon III faced an impossible decision: continue fighting and risk annihilation, or surrender. He surrendered. The capture of a reigning emperor stunned Europe. It was a humiliation beyond imagination. In Paris, when the news arrived, there was disbelief at first, then anger, then panic. The Second French Empire collapsed almost overnight. A new republic was proclaimed. But the war did not end. Instead, it grew harsher. Prussian forces advanced toward Paris. Civilians watched from shuttered windows as columns of German troops marched past vineyards and farms. Autumn leaves fell on muddy roads churned by artillery wheels. By late September, Paris was surrounded. The siege of Paris lasted months. Hunger crept into daily life like a shadow. Markets emptied. Bread grew scarce. People ate horses, then dogs, then zoo animals. The cold winter air carried the scent of desperation. Balloons rose above the city walls, carrying messages, a fragile lifeline to the outside world. Inside, Parisians shivered, listening to distant bombardment and wondering how it had come to this. Meanwhile, in the German camp at Versailles, something extraordinary was unfolding. In January of 1871, inside the glittering Hall of Mirrors, a room built to celebrate French royal power, the German princes gathered. Crystal chandeliers reflected uniforms and polished helmets. Boots clicked against marble floors. The air was cold, heavy with ceremony. There, in the palace of Louis XIV, King Wilhelm of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser of a new nation, the German Empire. It was not just a military victory. It was a political earthquake. The German states were unified under Prussian leadership. A new empire stood in the center of Europe, industrial, disciplined, confident. Its population rivaled France. Its economy surged with coal and steel production. Its army had proven itself devastatingly efficient. And France was forced to watch. The Treaty of Frankfurt ended the war formally in May of 1871. Its terms were severe. France ceded Alsace and much of Lorraine, provinces with mixed populations, German-speaking in parts, but deeply woven into French national identity. To lose territory is painful. To lose territory that carries cultural memory feels like amputation. 5 billion francs in indemnity were demanded, an enormous sum. German troops would occupy parts of France until it was paid. In towns across Alsace-Lorraine, families faced impossible choices: stay and become subjects of the German Empire, or leave ancestral homes for France. Some packed what they could carry. Others remained, resentful and uncertain. The border shifted, but identities did not adjust so easily. In France, a new word gained power: revanchism. Revenge. Children grew up hearing stories of lost provinces. Maps in classrooms shaded Alsace-Lorraine in mournful colors. Veterans remembered the humiliation of Sedan. The image of German troops marching through Paris burned into collective memory. National pride does not disappear quietly. It waits. Across the Rhine, the mood was different. Germany emerged not only victorious, but transformed. The war had proven the effectiveness of universal conscription, rail mobilization, coordinated general staff planning. It reinforced a belief in military strength as the foundation of national unity. Confidence surged. The new Reichstag convened. Industry boomed. Berlin's skyline changed as factories multiplied. But power in the center of Europe alters every calculation around it. Before 1870, France had been the dominant continental force. After 1871, Germany was. Britain watched from across the Channel, concerned but not yet alarmed. Russia recalculated its western borders. Austria-Hungary, Germany's southern neighbor, saw opportunity in alliance. The balance of power, that delicate European system where no one state should dominate, had been shattered. The war had lasted less than a year, but its consequences stretched far beyond its duration. It redrew borders. It birthed an empire. It humiliated a nation. It proved that modern industry, railways, and national mobilization could produce rapid, overwhelming war. And it planted something intangible, yet powerful: emotion. Humiliation in France. Confidence in Germany. Anxiety elsewhere. When historians search for the origins of the First World War, they often begin with alliances or assassinations. But the emotional core, the psychological wound, begins here. In burning fields near Sedan. In starving streets of Paris. In a mirrored palace where a new emperor was crowned on French soil. The German Empire stood tall in 1871, its banners fresh, its army undefeated. Yet its very existence altered the gravitational pull of Europe. Like a new massive object placed at the center of a fragile structure, it forced every surrounding piece to shift. France would rebuild. It would reform its army. It would wait. Germany, under Bismarck, would attempt to secure its position through diplomacy, aware that triumph could easily become vulnerability if enemies united. But even as treaties were drafted and alliances considered, one truth lingered beneath the surface. The War of 1870 had not ended rivalry. It had intensified it. And somewhere in classrooms in Paris, children traced the outline of Alsace-Lorraine with quiet determination. The next war would not come immediately. Decades would pass. Leaders would change. Empires would adjust. But the memory of humiliation and triumph would not fade. Europe had been reshaped in less than 12 months. Now it had to learn how to live with what it had created. Chapter 2. Bismarck's Web. The most dangerous wars are not always the ones fought with cannon fire. Some are fought in silence, in candlelit rooms, across polished tables, through whispers and signatures that bind empires together like threads in a web. After 1871, Europe did not explode into another conflict. Instead, it entered something more subtle, something quieter, a struggle to prevent the next catastrophe, while preparing for it at the same time. In the aftermath of victory, Germany stood powerful but exposed. The celebrations in Berlin had barely faded when a new reality set in. The German Empire was now the strongest land power in Europe, but was also newly born, geographically central, and potentially surrounded by rivals. Power can feel like protection, but in the middle of Europe, it can also feel like vulnerability. Otto von Bismarck understood this better than anyone. He had engineered German unification through war, but he had no desire to fight another. In fact, the Iron Chancellor believed that Germany, having achieved its goals, was a satiated power. It needed stability, not conquest. Its greatest threat was not weakness. It was encirclement. France was the immediate danger. Humiliated, stripped of Alsace-Lorraine, burning with revanchism, France wanted revenge. Bismarck's task was clear: isolate France diplomatically, so that if it ever sought war, it would stand alone. He began weaving. The first strands were subtle. In 1873, Germany joined with Austria-Hungary and Russia in what became known as the Three Emperors League. On paper, it looked like an alliance of conservative monarchs, three emperors pledging cooperation and stability. In reality, it was a delicate balancing act. Austria-Hungary and Russia were historic rivals in the Balkans, both eyeing the weakening Ottoman Empire. Their interests collided repeatedly, but Bismarck believed that if he could keep Berlin friendly with both Vienna and St. Petersburg, France would find no Eastern partner. Imagine a table with three heavy stones placed carefully so that none tips the balance. That was Bismarck's diplomacy. Every agreement had to counterweight another. Meanwhile, the memory of 1870 remained vivid. French politicians rebuilt their army. Military reforms accelerated. Young men drilled in muddy fields outside Paris, rifles slung across shoulders. In classrooms, teachers pointed to maps showing lost provinces shaded in mourning. The French Third Republic stabilized politically, and slowly, methodically, it searched for allies. Bismarck moved faster. In 1878, the Congress of Berlin convened to resolve tensions sparked by Russian victories against the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans were once again volatile, a region of tangled ethnicities and fading imperial authority. Russia had hoped to expand influence dramatically, but Austria-Hungary feared Slavic nationalism spreading into its own fragile empire. In the grand halls of Berlin, diplomats gathered beneath chandeliers and portraits of past rulers. The air smelled faintly of wax and paper. Voices remained controlled, but beneath the politeness lay suspicion. Bismarck positioned Germany as the honest broker, mediating between Austria and Russia. He succeeded, temporarily. Austria gained administrative control over Bosnia and Herzegovina. Russia felt slighted but restrained. Germany remained on friendly terms with both. But peace achieved through compromise can leave quiet resentment. By 1879, the tension between Austria-Hungary and Russia had grown too sharp to ignore. Bismarck made a decision that would define the next decades. He formalized the dual alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a defensive pact. Each promised to support the other if attacked by Russia. The logic was cold and strategic. If Russia became hostile, Germany would not stand alone. But in strengthening ties with Vienna, Berlin risked alienating St. Petersburg. The web tightened. Italy entered the picture in 1882, joining Germany and Austria-Hungary in what became the Triple Alliance. Italy, resentful of French colonial expansion in North Africa, saw advantage in aligning with Berlin and Vienna. For Germany, Italy added diplomatic weight and extended the network isolating France. On maps, the alliance lines began to form visible blocks. Yet Bismarck still feared losing Russia. He understood geography with ruthless clarity. A war against France in the west and Russia in the east, a two-front war, would stretch Germany beyond endurance. It would be like fighting with one arm tied behind the back while being struck from both sides. So in 1887, he negotiated the reinsurance treaty with Russia, a secret agreement promising neutrality if either were attacked by a third power. It was diplomatic acrobatics. Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary against Russian aggression, yet secretly assuring Russia of neutrality under certain conditions. To outsiders, Europe appeared calm. But beneath the surface, it resembled a complex mechanical clock. Every gear had to turn precisely. One misalignment could jam the entire system. Life in Berlin during these years reflected confidence mixed with caution. Industrial growth surged. Rail lines multiplied like steel arteries. Factories hummed with activity, the smell of oil and hot metal filling the air. Workers streamed in and out of urban centers. The German General Staff refined war plans quietly, even as diplomats signed treaties. Preparation and prevention moved side by side. France, meanwhile, remained isolated. Its attempts to find allies were repeatedly frustrated. Britain maintained its policy of splendid isolation, focusing on empire rather than continental commitments. Russia, though resentful, remained diplomatically entangled with Germany. Austria-Hungary leaned firmly toward Berlin. For nearly 2 decades, Bismarck's system held, but it required constant attention. Like a spider maintaining tension on every strand of its web, Bismarck monitored every crisis: colonial disputes, Balkan uprisings, dynastic quarrels. He believed peace depended not on trust, but on careful calculation. Alliances were tools, not friendships. He also understood something deeper: that German power frightened others. To reassure them, he avoided colonial overreach. He discouraged naval rivalry with Britain. He emphasized Germany's contentment. Yet even in restraint, there was latent tension. Inside Austria-Hungary, ethnic division simmered. Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Serbs, each group carried its own aspirations. Vienna feared nationalist contagion. In Russia, Pan-Slavic movements encouraged protection of Slavic peoples under Ottoman or Habsburg rule. The Balkans remained unstable, a tinderbox not yet ignited. And then, in 1890, everything shifted. Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor, architect of German unity and guardian of European balance, was forced from office by a young emperor who believed he could manage diplomacy personally. Wilhelm sought a more assertive global role for Germany, a place in the sun. He disliked Bismarck's cautious complexity. When Bismarck left, the web began to loosen. One of the first major decisions of a new leadership was not to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. It seemed a minor administrative matter, but in diplomacy, omissions can be as consequential as declarations. Russia, feeling abandoned, turned toward France. By 1894, France and Russia formalized an alliance. It was precisely what Bismarck had feared for 2 decades: the possibility of a coordinated threat from east and west. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but its implications were enormous. In Paris, Russian naval visits were celebrated. Crowds cheered foreign sailors. Bands played. The scent of gunpowder salutes mixed with summer air. The once isolated republic now had a powerful partner. Germany, once master of European diplomacy, now faced the very encirclement Bismarck had worked tirelessly to prevent. The calm of the 1870s and 80s had not been natural peace. It had been engineered stability, dependent on one man's relentless attention and restraint. Without him, the gears began to grind differently. Yet in the early 1890s, few sensed how profound the change was. European capitals continued to host banquets and royal weddings. Trade flowed. Trains ran on schedule. Factories expanded. The illusion of equilibrium persisted. But beneath it, alliances were hardening into opposing camps. What Bismarck had built was not merely a diplomatic arrangement. It was a temporary dam holding back currents of nationalism, rivalry, and suspicion. With his departure, cracks appeared. Germany remained powerful, confident, industrially dynamic. But now it stood less as an honest broker and more as a central pillar of one alliance bloc. France no longer stood alone. Russia recalculated its loyalties. Austria-Hungary grew increasingly dependent on Berlin, and Britain, still aloof, began to watch more closely. Bismarck had believed that diplomacy could contain ambition, that careful treaties could manage pride, that stability could be constructed through balance. For nearly 20 years, he was right. But his system required caution in a world growing more competitive, more industrial, more nationalistic. It required leaders willing to accept limits. When the Iron Chancellor left the stage, Europe did not immediately plunge toward war. Instead, it drifted, subtly, steadily, toward polarization. The web had not collapsed overnight, but its threads were no longer held in the same careful tension. And in that quiet loosening, the possibility of a future general war, once remote, began to edge closer to reality. Chapter 3. The Fall of Restraint. The dismissal was quiet. No cannons fired. No crowds gathered in the streets. Yet in the spring of 1890, when Otto von Bismarck left office under pressure from his young emperor, something far larger than a political career ended. An era of restraint closed its doors, and Europe, though it did not yet realize it, began drifting into more dangerous waters. The new force at the center of a German empire was not cautious, not patient, not satisfied. Wilhelm II was ambitious, impulsive, and determined to reshape Germany's role in the world. He admired Britain's navy. He envied its empire. He believed Germany deserved equal prestige, not merely dominance on land, but global recognition. The phrase "a place in the sun" captured his vision perfectly. It sounded harmless, warm, aspirational, but in the competitive climate of Europe's imperial powers, it carried sharp edges. When Wilhelm dismissed Bismarck, he also dismissed the careful balancing act that had kept France isolated and Russia engaged. The reinsurance treaty with Russia, that secret promise of neutrality, was allowed to lapse. The reasoning seemed simple enough. Why maintain complicated agreements with a rival empire that might clash with Austria-Hungary? Why not pursue a more straightforward foreign policy? But diplomacy is rarely straightforward. In St. Petersburg, Russian officials noticed the silence for Berlin. Where once there had been back-channel reassurances, now there was distance. Russia's ambitions in the Balkans remained. Its fear of Austria-Hungary persisted. And now, without Germany's balancing hand, it began to look west. In Paris, the change was electric. France had spent nearly 2 decades diplomatically isolated, nursing its wounds from the Franco-Prussian War. Its generals had rebuilt the army. Its politicians had stabilized the Third Republic. But without allies, revenge was fantasy. When Russia signaled openness to cooperation, French diplomats moved quickly. Military delegations met in smoke-filled rooms. Rail timetables were compared. Mobilization plans were discussed in meticulous detail. By the mid-1890s, the Franco-Russian alliance was formalized. The very scenario Bismarck had spent his career preventing, France and Russia aligned on either side of Germany, had become reality. If geopolitics is like standing between 2 advancing walls, Germany had just allowed both walls to move closer. Yet in Berlin, confidence overshadowed concern. The German army remained the strongest in Europe. Its officer corps was professional, disciplined, and technologically advanced. Rail networks allowed rapid mobilization. Industrial output surged year by year. Steel mills glowed at night. The smell of coal and iron clung to the air of industrial cities like Essen and the Ruhr. Germany felt unstoppable. But power can breed overconfidence. Wilhelm's new direction, often described as Weltpolitik or world policy, aimed to expand German influence overseas. Colonies in Africa and the Pacific were acquired or strengthened. Though modest compared to Britain's vast empire, they symbolized ambition. Germany no longer presented itself as a continental power. It sought recognition as a global force. In London, policymakers watched closely. For decades, Britain had maintained what it proudly called splendid isolation. It avoided binding continental alliances, relying instead on naval supremacy to secure its interests. The Royal Navy was the shield of the empire, protecting trade routes that stretched from India to the Caribbean. As long as Britain's fleet outmatched any rival, it felt secure. Wilhelm admired that navy and wanted one like it. The idea of building a fleet capable of challenging Britain was not immediately embraced by all in Berlin. But advocates within the German government, particularly Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, argued that a powerful navy would force Britain to treat Germany as an equal. The logic was stark. If Germany could build a fleet strong enough to threaten British dominance in the North Sea, London would think twice before opposing Berlin's interests. Naval strategy, in simple terms, is like deterrence through intimidation. If your fleet can damage mine severely, I hesitate to provoke you. But Britain did not see deterrence. It saw challenge. As shipyards along the German coast began constructing modern battleships, the tension was subtle at first. The clang of hammers on steel echoed across docks. Workers riveted hull plates beneath gray skies. Smoke rose from industrial stacks. The high seas fleet took shape plank by plank. Across the channel, British admirals studied the numbers. They calculated tonnage, armor thickness, gun range, and they did not like what they saw. The relationship between Britain and Germany had once been relatively cordial. Shared royal bloodlines connected their monarchies. Trade flowed between them. But naval rivalry is uniquely destabilizing. Unlike land armies, which can be defensive in posture, fleets exist to project power. When two nations build battleships facing each other across narrow waters, suspicion grows quickly. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, old tensions simmered. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, struggled with internal ethnic divisions. The empire was a patchwork of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Serbs, and more. Nationalism spread like wildfire in the late 19th century. Newspapers championed ethnic pride. Student groups debated independence. Secret societies whispered about unity with neighboring states. Russia positioned itself as protector of Slavic peoples. Serbia, small but ambitious, dreamed of uniting South Slavs under its banner. Every crisis in the Balkans risked dragging Austria-Hungary and Russia toward confrontation. And Germany, tied to Vienna through alliance, could not remain neutral if conflict escalated. Wilhelm's diplomacy lacked Bismarck's cautious complexity. Where the Iron Chancellor preferred subtle maneuvering, the Kaiser often favored bold gestures and public statements. He spoke impulsively in interviews. He inserted himself into international disputes with dramatic flair. One such episode occurred in Morocco. France had been expanding its influence in North Africa, consolidating control over territories near Algeria. Germany, seeking to test the growing entente between Britain and France, intervened diplomatically. In 1905, Wilhelm made a highly publicized visit to Tangier, declaring support for Moroccan independence. It was a calculated challenge to French ambitions. The move shocked European capitals. Diplomatic conferences followed. Chapter 4. The Scramble for Africa. The map looked harmless at first. Just colors spreading across a continent. Red for Britain, blue for France, green, yellow, and purple marking territories claimed by Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy. But those colors were not paint. They were ambition. They were rivalry. And in the late 19th century, they began to bleed into European politics in ways no one fully anticipated. In the early 1880s, Africa was still largely unclaimed by European powers beyond coastal footholds. Vast interior regions remained outside formal imperial control. To European politicians, industrialists, and nationalists, that blankness felt like opportunity and risk. If one power moved first, others feared being left behind. It was not just about land. It was about prestige. In Berlin, Paris, London, and Brussels, empire became a symbol of national greatness. Industrial societies believed they required raw materials, rubber, cotton, minerals, and new markets for manufactured goods. But beneath the economic arguments lay something more visceral: national pride, a belief that a powerful country must display its strength visibly across the globe. The fever began to rise quickly. In 1884, European leaders gathered at the Berlin Conference. Otto von Bismarck hosted the meeting, presenting Germany as a neutral mediator once again. Around long, polished tables, diplomats negotiated the rules for claiming African territory. Maps were spread out. Lines were drawn. Boundaries sketched with little regard for ethnic realities on the ground. There were no African representatives present. The atmosphere inside the conference halls was orderly, almost calm. The smell of paper and ink, the rustle of documents, soft-spoken agreements. Outside, however, the consequences would be anything but calm. The Berlin Conference established the principle of effective occupation. In simple terms, it meant that a European power could not merely plant a flag and claim a vast territory. It had to demonstrate control, administration, military presence, infrastructure. That rule triggered a race. Powers rushed to stake claims before rivals could. Like runners hearing the crack of starting pistol, Europe surged into Africa. Britain expanded northward from the Cape Colony and southward from Egypt, dreaming of a continuous line of territory from Cairo to Cape Town. France pushed inland from West Africa toward the Sahara and beyond. Belgium's King Leopold claimed the vast Congo Basin as his personal possession, a territory larger than many European states combined. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II's growing influence, sought colonies as well. Though Bismarck had once been cautious about overseas entanglements, domestic pressure mounted for Germany to assert itself globally. Territories in East Africa, Southwest Africa, Cameroon, and Togo were claimed. In European capitals, colonial exhibitions displayed exotic goods and artifacts. Crowds wandered through pavilions adorned with palm fronds and carved sculptures. There was excitement, curiosity, pride. Newspapers celebrated each new acquisition as a triumph. But on the African continent, the story unfolded differently. Local kingdoms, communities, and empires faced encroachment from heavily armed foreign forces. In some regions, treaties were signed under coercion. In others, resistance erupted. The clash between European industrial firepower and indigenous armies was often devastatingly unequal. The crack of modern rifles echoed across savannas. Machine guns, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, cut down warriors armed with spears and older firearms. Smoke drifted over grasslands. Villages burned. The smell of gunpowder mingled with dust and fear. The scramble for Africa was not merely a competition of flags. It was a contest of will and violence. Yet for European policymakers, the primary concern remained rivalry with one another. One of the earliest flashpoints came in 1898 at Fashoda, a small outpost on the Nile. French forces advancing eastward from West Africa met British forces moving southward from Egypt. Both sought control of the Upper Nile region. The standoff was tense. Two imperial armies, facing each other in a remote Sudanese town, thousands of miles from their capitals. Telegrams flew back and forth. Newspapers in Paris and London demanded firmness. For a moment, war between Britain and France seemed possible. In the end, France backed down. The Fashoda incident resolved peacefully, and surprisingly, it laid groundwork for future cooperation between the two powers. But the lesson was clear: colonial disputes could escalate dangerously. Meanwhile, Germany's colonial presence remained relatively modest compared to Britain or France. Yet German leaders resented their late arrival to the imperial race. They believed their growing industrial power entitled them to greater overseas influence. The acquisition of colonies did not significantly alter Europe's economic balance. Trade with Africa was limited compared to trade within Europe or with the Americas. But psychologically, empire mattered deeply. In Germany, nationalist groups argued that colonial expansion proved the nation's vitality. Schoolchildren learned about overseas territories. Maps in classrooms colored German possessions with pride. A sense of global destiny began to take root. Britain, accustomed to naval supremacy and vast imperial reach, viewed Germany's ambitions with increasing suspicion. Though colonial territories were geographically distant, the competition they symbolized was intimate and immediate. Empire was no longer just about Africa. It was about status within Europe. France, still nursing its wound from 1871, saw colonial expansion as a means to restore prestige. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine remained painful. Overseas acquisitions offered compensation, proof that France remained a great power. Russia expanded in Central Asia. Italy sought territories in East Africa. Even smaller powers joined the race. By the early 1900s, nearly the entire African continent had been partitioned among European empires. Only Ethiopia and Liberia retained formal independence. The scramble created borders that ignored ethnic realities, planting seeds of future conflicts beyond Europe. But in the immediate term, its greatest impact was on European rivalry. Every colonial acquisition altered perceptions of strength. Every dispute heightened mistrust. Diplomats might settle a crisis in Africa, but the underlying competition remained unresolved. Germany's sense of being encircled grew. Though it possessed colonies, it felt overshadowed by Britain's massive empire. Britain's leaders, meanwhile, began to perceive Germany not merely as a continental rival, but as a potential global challenger. The imperial race fed into naval policy. To protect overseas territories, fleets were required. Sea lanes had to be secured. Coaling stations established. The logic of empire intertwined with the logic of naval expansion. The result was predictable. Germany's naval buildup accelerated. Britain responded. In European ports, shipyards thundered day and night. Steel plates clanged. Riveters worked in deafening noise. Battleships took shape, floating fortresses bristling with guns. The launch of a single vessel could shift strategic calculations. The competition was not always overtly hostile. There were treaties, conferences, and gestures of goodwill. But beneath diplomacy lay rivalry fueled by imperial ambition. The scramble for Africa also intensified nationalist rhetoric. Newspapers portrayed rival powers as obstacles to national greatness. Political speeches invoked destiny, civilization, and strength. Public opinion hardened. In Berlin, Paris, and London, few citizens considered Africa's fate in humanitarian terms. Instead, they measured success in miles of territory and flags planted. The late 19th century had once seemed a period of stabilization under Bismarck's careful diplomacy. But imperial competition introduced new variables. It extended rivalry beyond Europe's borders, magnifying tensions. And while colonial disputes were often resolved without war, each crisis left a residue of distrust. The illusion of calm masked an increasingly competitive environment. By the turn of the century, Europe stood divided into alliance blocs. Germany and Austria-Hungary formed one core. France and Russia, strengthened by cooperation, formed another. Britain, though not formally aligned at first, found itself drawn closer to France and Russia by shared concerns over German ambition. The scramble for Africa did not directly cause the First World War, but it deepened rivalries. It normalized competition. It accustomed European powers to viewing one another as obstacles to global dominance. It transformed foreign policy from cautious balance into assertive projection. In colonial capitals, flags fluttered over distant lands. In European capitals, policymakers recalculated power. The colors on the map had solidified, and as imperial pride swelled, so too did the stakes of any confrontation between the great powers. The world seemed larger than ever, empires spanning continents. Yet Europe itself felt smaller, tighter, more compressed by ambition. The scramble had ended with partition, but the competition it unleashed had only begun. And soon, that competition would move from distant savannas back to the heart of Europe itself. Chapter 5. The Anglo-German Naval Arms Race. The sea was calm the morning she slid into the water. Workers stepped back. Officers straightened their uniforms. Crowds leaned forward as steel met tide. When HMS Dreadnought was launched in 1906, it did not just create a battleship. It erased every other battleship in existence. In that moment, an arms race became inevitable. For Britain, the ocean was not a boundary. It was lifeblood. Every loaf of bread in London, every bale of cotton in Manchester, every crate of tea from India depended on sea lanes guarded by the Royal Navy. For more than a century, Britain had lived by one unspoken rule. The fleet must be stronger than any two rivals combined. Naval supremacy was not ambition. It was survival. Across the North Sea, Germany watched. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany's industrial rise had been meteoric. Steel output rivaled Britain's. Rail networks stretched like arteries across the continent. German science and engineering flourished. Yet prestige in the late 19th century was measured not just in factories, but in fleets. To Wilhelm, the British Empire gleamed like a symbol of destiny. He admired it openly, sometimes awkwardly, but admiration quickly turned to competition. At the center of Germany's naval vision stood Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. His strategy was blunt and calculated. If Germany could build a fleet powerful enough to inflict catastrophic damage on the Royal Navy, even if Germany lost in a direct confrontation, Britain would hesitate to challenge it. This became known as the risk theory. In simple terms, it meant building a navy so dangerous that your enemy fears the cost of fighting you. The plan required massive shipbuilding. Along the docks of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, the noise was relentless. Steel plates were hoisted into place. Rivet guns hammered rhythmically. Sparks flashed in dark hull interiors. The smell of oil, hot metal, and salt air mixed together. Workers labored long shifts beneath gray skies, constructing what would become the high seas fleet. In Britain, newspapers began reporting German naval expansion with increasing alarm. Admiralty officials studied intelligence reports detailing tonnage, armor thickness, gun caliber. The numbers mattered. Battleships were the capital ships of their era, floating fortresses armed with enormous guns capable of firing shells weighing nearly a ton. Before 1906, naval strength had been measured incrementally. Fleets evolved gradually. But HMS Dreadnought changed everything. Powered by steam turbines, armed with an all-big gun configuration, she was faster and more powerful than any ship afloat. Overnight, older battleships became obsolete. Britain had intended to secure its dominance. Instead, it triggered a reset. Now, both nations began building from zero. For Germany, the launch of Dreadnought was both challenge and opportunity. If every navy was starting fresh, Germany could close the gap more quickly. The North Sea became the focal point of tension. Look at a map. Britain sits off the European coast like a watchful sentinel. Germany's coastline stretches along the southern shore of that same body of water. The distance between them is narrow, close enough for fleets to confront one another rapidly. In British dockyards, construction accelerated. Workers in Portsmouth and Glasgow labored under floodlights. The clang of hammers echoed late into the night. "We want 8, and we won't wait," became a popular slogan in Parliament, demanding more dreadnoughts to match Germany's program. Budget debates grew heated. Taxpayers felt the weight of escalating naval expenditure. But fear proved persuasive. In Berlin, Reichstag sessions were equally intense. Naval bills were presented to expand construction. Tirpitz argued passionately that Germany's global status depended on maritime power. Critics warned of antagonizing Britain unnecessarily. Wilhelm supported expansion. Every new keel laid down deepened suspicion across the channel. Yet the arms race was not only about hardware. It reshaped diplomacy. Britain had long remained aloof from continental alliances. But as Germany's fleet grew, British policymakers reconsidered their position. The possibility of a hostile power dominating the North Sea and potentially threatening British trade routes was unacceptable. Gradually, Britain moved closer to France. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 resolved colonial disputes between the two nations. It was not a formal military alliance, but it signaled warming relations. Joint naval discussions followed. British planners began considering the French fleet as a partner rather than a rival. Germany's attempt to elevate its status had unintended consequences. Instead of isolating France, it strengthened cooperation between former adversaries. The tension was palpable in everyday life. In London pubs, men debated German intentions. In Berlin cafes, intellectuals spoke of Britain's arrogance. Newspapers fueled nationalism on both sides. Cartoons depicted rival admirals glaring across stormy seas. The naval race also had a psychological dimension. Battleships symbolized power in the most visible way possible. When one nation launched a dreadnought, it was not subtle. The event was public, celebrated, photographed. It communicated ambition directly. Steel hulls gleaming under sunlight. Flags snapping in ocean wind. Brass bands playing as champagne bottles shattered against bows. Each launch was a statement. By 1910, the scale of competition was staggering. Both nations poured enormous resources into fleet construction. Naval strategists debated tactics, line of battle formations, gunnery range, armor thickness. War games simulated North Sea engagements. The smell of coal smoke hung heavy over naval bases. Sailors drilled relentlessly. Engines roared during test runs. Gunnery exercises thundered across open water. Yet there was a paradox. Despite the feverish buildup, both sides understood that an all-out naval battle would be catastrophic. Dreadnoughts were expensive. Crews were highly trained. Losses would be devastating. The race was as much about deterrence as preparation. Still, deterrence requires credible threat. Germany's high seas fleet grew formidable, but never surpassed Britain's Royal Navy. Britain maintained its two-power standard. Yet the narrowing gap unsettled British leaders. In 1911, another crisis intensified tensions, the Second Moroccan Crisis. When Germany sent the gunboat Panther to Agadir, Britain interpreted it as a possible move toward establishing a naval base on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Such a base would threaten trade routes and potentially encircle British interests. The reaction in London was fierce. The Chancellor of the Exchequer delivered a speech warning that Britain would not tolerate humiliation or strategic disadvantage. The crisis passed without war, but distrust deepened. Naval rivalry spilled into broader geopolitical calculation. Germany, feeling increasingly encircled by France, Russia, and now Britain's alignment with them, doubled down on military planning. The Schlieffen Plan, designed to defeat France quickly before Russia fully mobilized, became central to German strategy. Britain, meanwhile, began informal military conversations with France, including discussions about deploying the British Expeditionary Force to the continent in case of war. The North Sea was quiet on its surface. Fishing boats drifted. Waves rolled gently. But beneath that calm lay fleets poised for confrontation. Young sailors stood watch on steel decks, gazing across gray horizons. They could not know that in a few years, those waters would host one of the largest naval battles in history. The arms race also influenced domestic politics. In Germany, naval expansion fostered nationalism. It united various political factions behind a visible symbol of strength. In Britain, fear of German aggression rallied public opinion around defense spending. Militarism seeped into culture. Children played with toy warships. Popular novels imagined future naval battles. Public imagination became accustomed to the idea of conflict. Yet war remained theoretical. Trade between Britain and Germany remained strong. Cultural exchange continued. Royal families intermarried. Economies intertwined. Many believed economic interdependence would prevent outright conflict. But economics and emotion do not always align. Every dreadnought launched reinforced the idea that rivalry was structural, not temporary. By the eve of 1914, the naval race had stabilized somewhat. Britain retained superiority. Germany's fleet was powerful but contained. Neither side desired immediate war. And yet, the consequences were lasting. Britain had abandoned splendid isolation and moved closer to France and Russia. Germany had confirmed British suspicion. Europe's alliance blocks solidified further. The sea, once a shared highway of commerce, had become a boundary of mistrust. The Anglo-German naval arms race did not begin with gunfire. It began with steel, ambition, and fear. And though no shots were fired between them before 1914, the psychological line had been drawn. Across the North Sea, two great fleets waited. The balance of power had shifted from land alone to ocean depths. And in that cold expanse of water between Britain and Germany, the quiet competition of dreadnoughts echoed far louder than cannon fire ever could. Chapter 6. The alliance blocks solidify. It did not happen with a single signature. It was not announced with fanfare or trumpets. There was no moment when Europe officially divided itself in two. Instead, it happened slowly, through quiet conversations, careful calculations, secret clauses, and subtle shifts in trust. By the early 20th century, the continent no longer resembled a web of flexible diplomacy. It looked more like two opposing camps, staring at each other across an invisible line. And once that line hardened, any spark would have consequences far beyond its origin. After the fall of Bismarck's balancing system and the rise of Kaiser Wilhelm II's assertive foreign policy, the architecture of European diplomacy began to change shape. The Franco-Russian alliance had already formed in the 1890s. Germany and Austria-Hungary were bound tightly together through the dual alliance. Italy had joined them in what became known as the Triple Alliance. But alliances on paper are not the same as alliances in spirit. Italy, though formally aligned with Germany and Austria-Hungary, harbored territorial ambitions against Austria itself. Its commitment was conditional, its loyalty uncertain. The alliance structure was not yet rigid, but it was becoming so. Across Europe, military staffs were adjusting to this new reality. In Berlin, officers studied maps, not merely of France or Russia individually, but of coordinated threats from both directions. The fear of a two-front war haunted German strategy. The Schlieffen Plan, refined year after year, aimed to defeat France swiftly through a massive flanking maneuver before turning east toward Russia. Its logic was mechanical and unforgiving, like a spring wound tightly, ready to snap forward at the first sign of mobilization. In Paris, French planners revised their own strategy. Plan 17 emphasized offensive spirit, a rapid thrust in Alsace-Lorraine if war came. The lost provinces were not only strategic objectives, they were emotional ones. Soldiers trained with that memory etched into their national consciousness. In St. Petersburg, Russian mobilization schedules were expanded. Rail lines were extended deeper into the empire. Troop deployments were rehearsed. The sheer size of Russia meant mobilization would be slower, but once underway, its manpower was immense. Military preparation became synchronized with alliance commitments. Yet Britain still stood apart, at least formally. For decades, London had avoided permanent continental alliances. Its empire spanned the globe. Its navy ruled the seas. It preferred flexibility. But German naval expansion and assertive diplomacy changed the calculus. The Entente Cordiale between Britain and France in 1904 resolved colonial disputes that had once nearly led to war. It was not a binding military alliance. It was more like a handshake, an understanding that rivalry had become less useful than cooperation. When Germany challenged French influence in Morocco in 1905, Britain sided diplomatically with France. The message was clear: Germany would not easily isolate Paris again. The process continued in 1907 with the Anglo-Russian Convention. Britain and Russia settled long-standing disputes in Central Asia, dividing spheres of influence in Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. Suspicion remained, but cooperation became possible. With that agreement, the shape of Europe crystallized. On one side stood the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. On the other stood what would soon be known as the Triple Entente: France, Russia, Britain. The word Entente implied understanding rather than formal obligation. But in practice, it meant coordination. Military conversations intensified. Naval cooperation was discussed. Strategic assumptions shifted. The continent had organized itself into two armed networks. In Berlin, this development deepened anxiety. German leaders increasingly spoke of encirclement. To the west stood France, fortified and determined. To the east stood Russia, vast and mobilizing. To the north stood Britain, with its unmatched navy. Geography felt claustrophobic. Germany's central position, once a source of strength, now felt like a vulnerability. It was the hinge between two massive doors that might close simultaneously. Austria-Hungary leaned more heavily on Germany than ever before. Its internal ethnic divisions grew sharper. Nationalist movements within its borders threatened cohesion. Vienna's leaders feared Serbian ambitions in the Balkans, supported indirectly by Russia. If Austria faced conflict in the Balkans, Germany would be expected to stand with it. The alliance was defensive, but in a world of rising tensions, defense and offense could blur quickly. Italy's position remained ambiguous. While officially part of the Triple Alliance, it maintained quiet understandings with France. It sought its own advantage in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Its loyalties were transactional. In Paris, The Franco-Russian alliance was not merely symbolic. Military conventions specified coordinated mobilization schedules. If Germany attacked one, the other would mobilize. The system resembled interlocking gears. Turn one, and the others moved. The rigidity was growing. Diplomacy increasingly took place within alliance frameworks rather than across them. Trust across blocs declined. Within blocs, consultation intensified. The Balkan region became the most volatile testing ground for this system. The Ottoman Empire's gradual retreat from Europe left power vacuums. Serbia expanded its influence, fueled by dreams of uniting South Slavs. Austria-Hungary feared that such nationalism would destabilize its own Slavic populations. Russia saw itself as protector of Slavs, particularly Serbia. Every Balkan crisis risked pulling in the alliance networks. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories it had administered for decades, but never officially incorporated. Serbia protested vehemently. Russia backed Serbia diplomatically, but weakened by internal struggles after the Russo-Japanese War, it ultimately stepped back. Germany supported Austria firmly during the crisis, reinforcing their alliance. The message to Russia was unmistakable. In St. Petersburg, military reform accelerated. The humiliation of backing down would not be repeated easily. The alliance system was no longer merely defensive. It had become psychological reinforcement. Each crisis strengthened cohesion within blocs and sharpened hostility between them. Military spending increased across Europe. Conscription terms lengthened. New artillery designs were tested. Rail mobilization timetables were refined. In Berlin, Paris, and St. Petersburg, war games simulated scenarios involving full alliance participation. The assumption was no longer localized conflict. It was continental war. And yet, daily life continued. In Vienna, cafes bustled with intellectual debate. In Berlin, electric lights illuminated boulevards. In Paris, artists gathered in Montmartre. Industrial output soared. Trade flourished. The outward appearance of civilization seemed stable. But beneath the surface, the alliance blocs had hardened into expectations. If one power mobilized, others would follow. If one nation declared war, its allies would not stand idle. The system created deterrence, but also danger. It was like building a house wired with connected alarms. A small disturbance in one room could trigger bells throughout the structure. Leaders still believed war could be avoided. They trusted in diplomacy. They assumed rational calculation would prevail. Yet rational calculation now included alliance obligations. When Germany evaluated a crisis, it considered Austria's position. When France assessed risk, it weighed Russian commitments. Britain monitored continental developments with increasing seriousness. Neutrality became less plausible. The alliances also influenced public opinion. Newspapers aligned narratives with bloc loyalties. Citizens began to view rival powers not as occasional competitors, but as structural adversaries. National pride intertwined with alliance solidarity. By the early 1900s, Europe's diplomatic landscape resembled two massive, fortified camps facing one another across a tense frontier. There were still cross-bloc conversations. There were still efforts to reduce tension. But the fundamental architecture had shifted. No longer was there a central mediator balancing all sides. No longer was there fluid flexibility in alignment. The continent had divided itself. And though war had not yet broken out, the mental map of Europe had already been redrawn. In Berlin, officers stood before massive wall maps marked with colored pins representing Allied and enemy forces. In Paris, similar maps bore their own colored markers. In St. Petersburg, planners traced rail lines westward. In London, Admiralty charts outlined fleet positions. Everyone was calculating. The alliance blocs solidified not because war was desired, but because security seemed to demand it. Each nation sought protection. Each sought reassurance. But in binding themselves together so tightly, they ensured that if conflict came, it would not remain contained. The stage was set. And somewhere in the Balkans, the region that had tested alliances repeatedly, tensions were rising again. Europe was now organized for peace and prepared for war. The next crisis would reveal which force proved stronger. Chapter 7. The First Moroccan Crisis. The crowd in Tangier did not know they were watching a rehearsal for catastrophe. They saw only ceremony. White uniforms in the sun, flags snapping in the warm Atlantic wind, the gleam of a monarch's helmet beneath North African skies. But when Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped onto Moroccan soil in the spring of 1905, he was not simply visiting a distant port. He was testing the strength of Europe's new alignments. And in doing so, he would tighten them. Morocco, at the turn of the century, was one of the few remaining independent kingdoms in North Africa. France, already entrenched in Algeria and Tunisia, sought to extend its influence westward. It moved cautiously, negotiating financial reforms and advisory roles within the Moroccan government. To Paris, it was a logical extension of its North African presence, a consolidation of regional power. To Berlin, it was something else entirely. Germany had watched Britain and France draw closer through the Entente Cordiale of 1904. That agreement had resolved colonial disputes between them, but it also signaled warming relations. German policymakers worried that France was slipping out of isolation permanently. If the Entente hardened into a military partnership, Germany's fear of encirclement would deepen. Morocco offered an opportunity. If Germany challenged France's ambitions there, perhaps Britain would remain neutral. Perhaps the Entente was only superficial. Perhaps France would stand alone. The Kaiser's arrival in Tangier was deliberate theater. He declared support for Moroccan sovereignty and called for an international conference to resolve the issue. The message was clear. Germany would not accept France's expanding influence without consultation. In Paris, the reaction was immediate and heated. Newspapers printed bold headlines warning of German provocation. Government ministers debated fiercely. The scent of ink and paper filled editorial offices as journalists framed the crisis as a test of national dignity. But beneath the outrage lay calculation. France was not ready for war. Its army reforms were ongoing. Its alliance with Russia existed, but coordination was still developing. The question hung in the air. Would Britain support France if matters escalated? In London, the German move was interpreted as more than a colonial dispute. It was seen as a challenge to the Entente itself. British leaders asked whether Germany sought to drive a wedge between London and Paris. The answer would shape the future. Diplomatic cables flashed between capitals. Conversations grew tense. The smell of cigar smoke lingered in private rooms where officials weighed options. Germany proposed an international conference, ostensibly to preserve Moroccan independence. France reluctantly agreed. The stage shifted to Algeciras in southern Spain in early 1906. Representatives from 13 powers gathered in ornate halls overlooking the Mediterranean. Outside, waves crashed gently against stone quays. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but gentle. German diplomats argued for open access and limitations on French control. French representatives defended their reforms. Britain sided firmly with France, much to Berlin's disappointment. One by one, other nations leaned toward the Franco-British position. When the conference concluded, France retained significant influence in Morocco, though with international oversight. Germany achieved little tangible gain, but the consequences were profound. Germany had hoped to demonstrate French isolation. Instead, it revealed its own diplomatic isolation. Britain's support for France during the crisis strengthened the Entente. In Berlin, disappointment mixed with frustration. The Kaiser's bold gesture had not fractured Anglo-French cooperation. It had reinforced it. Across Europe, observers took note. If Germany challenged France again, Britain might stand beside it. The alliance blocs, already forming, seemed more real than ever. The crisis also intensified military thinking. In France, military planners saw confirmation that Germany could be aggressive in unexpected theaters. Coordination with Britain gained importance. Informal staff talks began, quiet conversations about how British forces might support France in future war. In Germany, the General Staff interpreted Britain's stance as evidence that any major continental conflict would likely involve the Royal Navy. The North Sea felt narrower. The Moroccan Crisis also influenced public opinion. In Germany, nationalist newspapers portray the outcome as unjust, evidence of British and French collusion to deny Germany its rightful place among global powers. In France and Britain, Germany was increasingly depicted as provocative, seeking confrontation. Mistrust deepened. For ordinary citizens, the crisis may have seemed distant. Morocco was far away, after all. But the emotional undercurrent was closer to home. Pride had been tested. Alliances had been demonstrated. The sound of waves on Moroccan shores faded, but its echo carried across Europe. The crisis had not resulted in war. It had clarified lines. France and Britain were closer than before. Germany felt more encircled. Austria-Hungary observed carefully, aware that any future Balkan dispute might unfold within this hardened framework. And the Balkans were stirring. Even as Morocco settled uneasily under French influence, tensions elsewhere grew sharper. Austria-Hungary eyed Bosnia and Herzegovina. Serbia's nationalism intensified. Russia's ambitions simmered after its humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War. The Moroccan episode revealed something critical. Crises could erupt far from Europe's core, yet ripple back into continental alignment. Diplomacy was no longer flexible improvisation. It was bloc politics. The first Moroccan crisis did not cause war, but it stripped away illusions. Germany now understood that Britain would not easily abandon France. France gained confidence in British support. Russia observed the strengthening entente with cautious approval. The web of alliances tightened another notch. And though the conference at Algeciras ended with signatures rather than gunfire, the psychological consequences lingered. Europe had faced a test, and instead of dissolving tensions, it had clarified loyalties. The next crisis would not occur in North Africa. It would arise closer to home, and by then, the camps would be even more firmly drawn. Chapter 8. The Bosnian Crisis. The train rolled into the station at Sarajevo beneath a gray autumn sky. The air carried the faint scent of coal smoke and damp stone. Uniformed officials stood in neat lines, boots polished, metals glinting faintly in the pale light. To the outside observer, it looked like routine imperial administration, another day in the far reaches of a fading empire. But in October of 1908, what Austria-Hungary was about to announce would shake the fragile balance of Europe. For 3 decades, Bosnia and Herzegovina had existed in a peculiar limbo. After the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Austria-Hungary had been granted the right to occupy and administer the provinces, though they technically remained part of the Ottoman Empire. It was a diplomatic compromise, an arrangement designed to manage Balkan instability without redrawing borders outright. But compromise is often temporary. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was weakening further. Nationalist movements surged throughout its territories. Serbia, newly confident after recent successes, dreamed openly of uniting South Slavic peoples, including those living in Bosnia. Russia, claiming kinship with Slavic nations, watched closely. Austria-Hungary felt the ground shifting beneath it. The Habsburg Empire was a patchwork of ethnicities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians. Nationalism, that potent force sweeping Europe, threatened its cohesion. If Slavic nationalism succeeded in Bosnia, it might inspire unrest within Austria-Hungary's own borders. The imperial leadership decided to act. On October 6, 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. The announcement traveled across telegraph wires like shockwave. In Vienna, officials framed it as a necessary administrative clarification. In Belgrade, it was seen as provocation. Serbia erupted in outrage. Crowds gathered in streets, waving flags, shouting slogans. Newspapers condemned Vienna's audacity. The scent of ink and agitation filled printing presses working through the night. Serbia had long hoped to expand into Bosnia, to unite Serbs across borders. The annexation crushed that aspiration, at least for now. Russia felt humiliated. Still recovering from defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and internal revolution, Russia was not ready for a major conflict. Yet it had positioned itself as protector of Slavic interests. Austria's unilateral move challenged that role. Germany stood firmly behind Austria-Hungary. In Berlin, officials signaled unequivocal support. If Russia intervened militarily, Germany would back Vienna. The message was blunt. Russia faced a choice. Its army was still reorganizing. Rail networks were incomplete. War in 1908 would be risky. After tense deliberation, Russia stepped back, accepting the annexation reluctantly. The humiliation stung. In St. Petersburg, the air felt heavy with frustration. Military reform accelerated. The lesson was clear. Next time, Russia must be prepared. The Bosnian crisis lasted months, filled with diplomatic maneuvering and military posturing. Armies mobilized partially. Troops moved closer to borders. The smell of damp uniforms and oil filled barracks as soldiers awaited orders that never came. War did not erupt, but the emotional damage was profound. For Serbia, the annexation confirmed that Austria-Hungary was an obstacle to its national destiny. Secret societies, including the Black Hand, intensified their activities. The idea of direct action, even violent action, gained appeal. For Austria-Hungary, the crisis reinforced dependence on Germany. Without Berlin's backing, Vienna might have faced Russian intervention. For Germany, the episode seemed like a diplomatic success. Its firm support had deterred Russia. Yet it also reinforced the perception of a hardened alliance bloc confronting the Entente. France and Britain observed cautiously. Neither had direct stakes in Bosnia, but both recognized the growing tension between their Russian partner and the Central Powers. The crisis exposed the volatility of the Balkans. Picture the region like dry brush beneath a summer sun. A single spark could ignite it. Bosnia's annexation had been such a spark, one that nearly ignited a larger fire. In Sarajevo, daily life continued. Markets bustled. Church bells rang. But beneath routine lay resentment. Some Bosnian Serbs viewed Austrian rule as foreign domination. Nationalist sentiment simmered quietly. The crisis also deepened mistrust between alliances. Russia blamed Germany for backing Austria so forcefully. Germany interpreted Russian frustration as future hostility. Austria-Hungary felt emboldened, but also more entangled with Berlin's fate. The alliance system grew more rigid. Military staffs studied the crisis carefully. What if Russia had mobilized fully? What if Germany had hesitated? What if Britain had intervened? Contingency plans were refined. The Bosnian crisis demonstrated how quickly local disputes could escalate into continental tension. It also showed that backing down, while avoiding immediate war, could sow bitterness for years. Serbia did not forget. Russia did not forget. Austria-Hungary believed it had secured its position, but at the cost of intensifying regional hostility. The Balkans became more than a peripheral concern. They became the fault line of Europe. And within that fault line, nationalist movements grew bolder. Secret meetings were held in dimly lit rooms. Oaths sworn. Maps studied. Dreams of unification whispered. The annexation of Bosnia was not a battlefield victory. No cannons roared. No trenches were dug. Yet its impact rivaled that of open war. It hardened positions. It accelerated military reform. It deepened alliance commitments. And it left Serbia seething. The next Balkan crisis would not be resolved so easily. The train tracks leading through Sarajevo remained quiet in 1908. But 6 years later, those same tracks would carry an imperial heir to a city that had not forgotten. And when he arrived, the consequences would echo far beyond the Balkans. Chapter 9. The Second Moroccan Crisis. The gunboat appeared on the horizon like a shadow. It was small compared to the massive dreadnoughts that now defined naval power, but its presence was unmistakable. In July of 1911, the German vessel Panther slipped into the Moroccan port of Agadir, its steel hull cutting through the Atlantic swell its flag snapping in the hot coastal wind. Local fishermen paused. French officials stiffened. In Berlin, the move was described as routine protection of German interests. In London and Paris, it was interpreted as something far more dangerous. The world had seen Morocco before. 6 years earlier, the first Moroccan crisis had tested alliances and revealed the growing solidarity between Britain and France. Germany had emerged diplomatically isolated. But the lesson Berlin drew was not retreat. It was resolve. Morocco, though formally independent, was slipping steadily under French influence. Political instability had led France to send troops to Fez earlier in 1911 to protect European nationals and restore order. To Germany, this looked like a de facto protectorate, another expansion of French power without international consultation. And once again, Germany chose to challenge it. The decision to send the Panther was deliberate, theatrical, and risky. Agadir was a quiet port on Morocco's southern Atlantic coast, far from the main centers of French activity. By sending a warship there, Germany signaled that it could project power wherever it chose. It was a reminder that the high seas fleet, though smaller than Britain's Royal Navy, was not insignificant. When news reached Paris, tension surged immediately. Newspapers printed dramatic headlines warning of German aggression. The smell of fresh ink hung heavy in editorial offices working around the clock. Politicians debated whether Germany intended to establish a naval base on the Atlantic, a move that would threaten French and British sea lanes alike. In London, the reaction was even sharper. The British Admiralty studied maps carefully. A German naval base at Agadir would sit along vital trade routes connecting Britain to its empire. The possibility, even if unlikely, was intolerable. David Lloyd George, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, delivered a speech at Mansion House that reverberated across Europe. He warned that Britain would not accept humiliation or the undermining of its strategic position. The tone was clear. Britain was prepared to stand firm. In Berlin, surprise mingled with irritation. German leaders had hoped to extract concessions, perhaps territory in French Congo, in exchange for recognizing French control in Morocco. The move was intended as leverage, not war. But the response from Britain indicated that Germany's challenge had been interpreted as broader than anticipated. Diplomatic cables flew across capitals. Conversations grew tense. The air and foreign ministries felt charged, thick with uncertainty. For weeks, Europe hovered on the edge of crisis. In the Moroccan heat, the Panther remained anchored, its presence symbolic yet potent. Sailors stood watch beneath blazing sun. The smell of salt and diesel drifted across the harbor. On land, rumors circulated among local populations uncertain of what European powers intended next. France began limited military preparations. Germany signaled readiness. Britain reinforced naval positions discreetly. The alliance blocks, forged through previous crises, now stood in sharper relief. France and Britain were aligned. Russia, though less directly involved, leaned towards Entente partners. Germany stood with Austria-Hungary. The crisis revealed something essential. Morocco was not merely a colonial dispute. It was a test of resolve between alliance networks. Behind closed doors, negotiations continued. Germany sought compensation, territory in Central Africa, for acknowledging French predominance in Morocco. France resisted initially, but the risk of war loomed large. The mood in European capitals fluctuated between defiance and dread. Stock markets trembled. Investors feared that a naval confrontation could ignite continental war. The scent of panic hovered in financial districts as traders shouted across crowded floors. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. In November of 1911, an agreement was reached. Germany recognized French control over Morocco. In return, France ceded portions of its Congo territory to Germany, modestly expanding German colonial holdings. The Panther departed Agadir. On the surface, the crisis ended without bloodshed. But beneath that calm lay deeper consequences. In Britain, the episode confirmed suspicions that Germany was willing to use military force to alter colonial arrangements. Public opinion hardened. Naval construction continued with renewed urgency. In France, the crisis strengthened ties with Britain. Military conversations deepened. The possibility of British support in a continental war seemed more plausible. In Germany, frustration simmered. Nationalists viewed the outcome as unsatisfactory, a modest territorial gain in Africa in exchange for recognizing French dominance. Critics argued that Germany had backed down under British pressure. The psychological impact was lasting. The Second Moroccan Crisis reinforced the perception that Europe was divided into two armed camps. It demonstrated how colonial disputes could escalate rapidly into continental tension, and it amplified fear. Fear in Britain that Germany sought to challenge its naval supremacy. Fear in Germany that Britain would side consistently with France. Fear in France that Germany might test its resolve again. The alliance system tightened another notch. Military planners absorbed lessons carefully. German strategists noted Britain's willingness to intervene diplomatically in support of France. French planners saw proof that British alignment was real. British leaders concluded that neutrality in a Franco-German conflict would be increasingly difficult. The crisis also influenced domestic politics. In Germany, naval advocates argued that only a stronger fleet could compel Britain to respect German interests. In Britain, those same advocates' arguments reinforced calls for maintaining naval superiority. Steel keels continued to be laid down in shipyards. The clang of construction echoed across coasts. The North Sea grew more crowded with dreadnoughts. The Moroccan port of Agadir returned to quiet routine. Fishing boats resumed their work. Markets reopened, but the memory of the gunboat lingered. The Second Moroccan Crisis was not a war. It felt like rehearsal. A small naval vessel had nearly triggered global conflict. The alliances had flexed. The reactions had been swift and polarized. Europe's leaders had stepped back from the brink again. But each step toward the brink left deeper footprints. By 1911, trust between Germany and Britain was thin. Between Germany and France, it was nearly non-existent. Russia continued military reforms, determined not to be caught unprepared again. The Balkans, meanwhile, simmered once more. As the Moroccan dispute cooled, tensions in southeastern Europe intensified. The Ottoman Empire's hold weakened further. Serbia's ambitions grew bolder. Austria-Hungary watched nervously. The focus of crisis was shifting geographically. The gunboat at Agadir had tested the Atlantic. The next explosion would come closer to the heart of Europe. And when it did, the hardened alliance blocs would respond not with caution, but with mobilization. The Panther had sailed away, but the waters of Europe remained restless. Chapter 10: The Balkan Wars. The first artillery shell burst over the hills of the Balkans in October of 1912, and for a moment, it seemed like just another regional conflict in a region long accustomed to violence. But this time, the smoke rising over Macedonia carried something heavier, the scent of empires collapsing and alliances tightening. The Balkan Wars were not world wars. They were smaller in scale, shorter in duration, and yet they pushed Europe closer to the edge than any crisis before them. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled much of southeastern Europe, but by the early 20th century, it was visibly weakening. Corruption, military defeats, nationalist uprisings. The once mighty empire was now referred to in European capitals as the sick man of Europe. And whenever a powerful state grows weak, its neighbors begin calculating. In Belgrade, Sofia, Athens, and Cetinje, leaders saw opportunity. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro formed what became known as the Balkan League. Though historically distrustful of one another, they shared a common goal: drive the Ottoman Empire out of Europe and claim its territories for themselves. Behind this coalition stood a complex web of influence. Russia quietly encouraged the formation of the League. As the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, it viewed Serbian expansion favorably. Austria-Hungary, by contrast, saw Serbian growth as a direct threat. A larger, more confident Serbia could inspire Slavic nationalism within the Habsburg Empire's own borders. The alliance blocs of Europe watched carefully. In October of 1912, the Balkan League struck. Ottoman forces, stretched thin and poorly coordinated, struggled to resist the coordinated offensives. Battles erupted across Thrace, Macedonia, and Albania. The crack of rifles echoed through mountain passes. Cannons thundered over valleys once quiet with pastoral life. The smell of smoke and churned earth filled the air. Serbian troops advanced with determination. Villagers lined roads, cheering or fleeing, depending on allegiance. The war was brutal, swift, and chaotic. In the First Balkan War, the Ottoman Empire lost almost all of its European territories west of Constantinople. It was a stunning collapse. Within months, centuries of imperial presence were erased. But victory created new problems. The Balkan League had agreed to fight together. It had not agreed clearly on how to divide the spoils. Bulgaria expected the largest share of Macedonia. Serbia, having sacrificed heavily in the fighting, expected expansion as well. Greece claimed strategic ports and territory in the south. Montenegro sought gains of its own. The Ottoman Empire had retreated, but the victors now turned suspicious eyes toward one another. In Vienna, alarm bells rang. Austria-Hungary was deeply unsettled by Serbia's territorial expansion. A stronger Serbia meant a stronger magnet for Slavic nationalism. It meant that Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs within the Habsburg Empire might dream more openly of unity with Belgrade. Austria-Hungary considered intervention. Germany backed its ally diplomatically, though it urged caution. Russia, meanwhile, celebrated Serbia's success, but sought to prevent Austrian interference. The alliance system loomed over the Balkans like a shadow. When the First Balkan War ended with the Treaty of London in May of 1913, the Ottoman Empire was nearly expelled from Europe. But dissatisfaction simmered. Bulgaria felt cheated by Serbia and Greece. Negotiations faltered. Tensions escalated. In June of 1913, Bulgaria attacked its former allies, igniting the Second Balkan War. The fighting was savage and confused. Former comrades now faced each other in muddy trenches and rocky hillsides. Machine guns rattled. Soldiers shouted in languages once united by cause, but now divided by ambition. Romania joined the fray against Bulgaria. Even the Ottomans seized the opportunity to reclaim territory. Within weeks, Bulgaria was defeated. The Treaty of Bucharest redrew borders yet again. Serbia emerged stronger than before. Greece gained valuable coastal territories. Bulgaria felt humiliated. The Balkans were more volatile than ever. For Serbia, the wars were transformative. Its territory had nearly doubled. Its population had grown. Its confidence surged. The vision of a South Slavic state, Yugoslavia, seemed less like a dream and more like an attainable future. In Belgrade, crowds celebrated victory. Flags waved. Bands played. The air smelled of smoke and celebration. Yet beneath jubilation lay defiance. Serbia now stood as a regional power. Austria-Hungary saw danger. Its leaders debated preventive war. Could Serbia be crushed before it grew too strong? Could the Slavic threat be neutralized? Germany counseled restraint, for now, but it reaffirmed support for Vienna if conflict escalated. Russia observed closely. It had backed Serbia diplomatically during the crisis. Its own military reforms, accelerated after the Bosnian crisis, were progressing. Confidence returned slowly. Britain and France, though less directly involved, monitored developments carefully. They understood that Balkan instability could trigger alliance obligations. The Balkan Wars also transformed military perceptions. Observers from across Europe watched the battles closely. They noted the devastating power of modern artillery. They saw how quickly mobilization could bring hundreds of thousands of men into combat. They observed trench lines forming in unexpected places. The scale of casualties shocked many. Hospitals overflowed. The smell of antiseptic mixed with blood. Soldiers wrote letters home describing exhaustion and horror. Civilians fled advancing armies, carrying what little they could. It was a preview, a smaller-scale rehearsal of the industrialized slaughter to come. The wars revealed weaknesses in Ottoman command. They demonstrated the potency of nationalism. They exposed how quickly alliances could shift. And most importantly, they sharpened hostility between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. By late 1913, Europe was exhausted by crisis. Yet tension remained high. Austria-Hungary felt encircled by Slavic ambition. Serbia felt empowered. Russia felt vindicated. Germany remained tied to Vienna. France and Britain stood aligned with Russia. The alliance blocs had endured another test. But unlike Morocco, where disputes were colonial and distant, the Balkan Wars unfolded in Europe's backyard. Railways leading toward the Balkans were upgraded. Mobilization timetables adjusted. Military staffs incorporated lessons from the fighting. The region had become the continent's most volatile fault line. In Sarajevo, the streets bore the weight of new uncertainty. Bosnia remained under Austrian rule, but Serbian nationalism echoed loudly nearby. The wars had ended, but not the hostility. Austria-Hungary increasingly viewed Serbia as an existential threat. Serbia saw Austria-Hungary as an oppressive empire obstructing its destiny. The gap between them narrowed. In Vienna's imperial halls, discussions grew darker. In Belgrade's cafes, nationalist rhetoric intensified. Europe had avoided general war again. But each crisis made avoidance harder. The Balkan Wars did not ignite the continent in 1912 or 13. Yet they changed the psychology of leaders. They demonstrated how quickly regional conflict could escalate. They solidified alliances. They inflamed national pride. And in the Balkans, where empires collided and ambitions intertwined, the ground remained dry. The next spark would not need much kindling. It would only need one moment. Chapter 11. Militarism and the Cult of the Offensive. The cheering crowds did not see the trenches yet. They saw uniforms, bright, polished, immaculate. They saw cavalry horses prancing beneath summer sunlight. They heard brass bands and felt pride swelling in their chests. Across Europe in the years before 1914, war did not look like mud and barbed wire. It looked glorious, quick, cleansing. And that belief would prove catastrophic. By the early 20th century, Europe was not only divided by alliances, it was saturated with militarism. Armies were not merely instruments of policy. They were symbols of national vitality. Officers were celebrated. Parades were public spectacles. Conscription turned millions of young men into trained reservists, ready to answer mobilization orders at a moment's notice. Military service was woven into identity. In Germany, the officer corps carried immense prestige. The Prussian tradition of discipline and professionalism shaped national culture. Young recruits marched beneath iron-gray skies, boots striking cobblestone in unison. The smell of gun oil and polished leather filled barracks. Drill commands echoed sharply. Precision was everything. France, determined to overcome the humiliation of 1870, embraced military spirit with equal intensity. The doctrine known as élan vital, the vital spirit, emphasized courage, aggression, and offensive momentum. French infantry trained to advance boldly, believing morale could overcome firepower. In Russia, reform followed the disasters of the Russo-Japanese War. Rail lines expanded westward. Mobilization timetables were revised. Artillery production increased. The sheer size of the Russian army was a source of pride, even as logistical weaknesses lingered. Austria-Hungary, internally fragile, relied heavily on its military to maintain cohesion. Officers commanded regiments composed of multiple ethnicities, their orders sometimes translated into several languages. Unity was enforced through hierarchy. Britain, though less militarized domestically due to its volunteer army tradition, maintained overwhelming naval strength. The Royal Navy was not only a military force, it was a national symbol. Schoolchildren learned about Trafalgar. Ship launches were celebrated as patriotic events. Militarism did not grow in isolation. It was fed by industrial capacity. Factories across Europe churned out rifles, artillery shells, machine guns. The hum of machinery never seemed to stop. Sparks flew in steel mills. Workers wiped soot from faces as rail cars loaded with munitions rolled toward depots. The technology of war had advanced dramatically since 1870. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery shells exploded with terrifying force. Railways enabled rapid mobilization of millions of men. Yet military doctrine often lagged behind technology. The prevailing belief among many European generals was that war, if it came, would be short. There were practical reasons for this assumption. Economic interdependence made prolonged war seem irrational. Mobilization plans were rigid and precise, designed for rapid deployment, not extended stalemate. Political leaders feared that long wars would destabilize societies. Thus emerged the cult of the offensive. In Berlin, the Schlieffen Plan embodied this mindset. Its architect, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, believed that speed and decisiveness were essential. Germany, facing potential war on two fronts, must strike France swiftly through Belgium, encircle Paris, and defeat it within weeks. Only then could it turn east to face Russia. The plan was intricate, almost mechanical. It depended on precise rail schedules and rapid troop movement. Like a massive clockwork mechanism, once set in motion, it could not easily be stopped or altered. In France, Plan 17 embraced similar offensive spirit. French forces would advance into Alsace-Lorraine at the outbreak of war, reclaiming lost territory and striking at German morale. The strategy prioritized initiative over caution. In Russia, mobilization plans assumed eventual offensive operations into East Prussia and Galicia. Across alliance blocks, the assumption was the same. Attack first, strike hard, finish quickly. The psychological atmosphere reinforced these doctrines. Newspapers glorified military strength. Popular literature romanticized cavalry charges. Military music stirred emotion. School textbooks emphasized national destiny. Even in intellectual circles, war was sometimes portrayed as purifying, a force that could sweep away decadence and restore vigor. Few anticipated the industrial slaughter that modern firepower would unleash. Military exercises became grand spectacles. Summer maneuvers saw tens of thousands of troops simulate massive engagements. Officers observed from horseback, binoculars in hand. Maps were studied intensely. Lessons were drawn, but often filtered through preconceived beliefs. There were dissenting voices. Some strategists warned that defensive weapons, particularly machine guns and rapid-fire artillery, would make offensive assaults costly. Observers of the Russo-Japanese War had seen trenches and heavy casualties. Yet the momentum of doctrine remained. Political leaders were increasingly constrained by military timetables. Mobilization was no longer a slow, adjustable process. It was a rigid cascade. In Germany, once mobilization began, trains would carry troops west in precise sequence. To halt the process midway risked chaos. Similar rigidity existed in France and Russia. Mobilization became almost synonymous with war. This created a dangerous dynamic. In a crisis, partial mobilization might be interpreted as hostile intent. Leaders feared being caught unprepared. The pressure to act quickly intensified. The alliance system amplified the effect. If one nation mobilized, its allies would feel compelled to follow. The interconnected plans formed a chain reaction mechanism. Militarism was not merely about hardware or doctrine. It was about mentality. Across Europe, young men grew up expecting service. Uniforms became rites of passage. Military virtues, discipline, courage, sacrifice, were celebrated as national ideals. The officer class held significant influence in political discussions. Generals advised monarchs and ministers with authority born of expertise. Civilian control over military planning weakened subtly. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II admired martial display. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph relied on his generals. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II deferred to military advisors during crises. The sound of boots on parade grounds became a familiar rhythm of European life. And beneath that rhythm lay competition. Army sizes increased. France extended conscription to 3 years in 1913 to match Germany's manpower. Germany responded with its own expansion bill. Russia accelerated reforms. The numbers were staggering. Millions of trained reservists stood ready. Rail networks were mapped for rapid troop deployment. Ammunition stockpiles grew. The continent resembled a loaded mechanism. Yet public enthusiasm masked underlying anxiety. The Second Moroccan Crisis and Balkan Wars had shown how quickly tensions could rise. Military readiness seemed prudent. Few questioned whether such readiness made restraint harder. The cult of the offensive created urgency. Generals believed that delay meant defeat. Waiting allowed the enemy to mobilize fully. Speed was survival. This mindset reduced diplomatic flexibility. In a crisis, leaders would face immense pressure from military staffs, urging immediate mobilization to avoid disadvantage. Militarism had become embedded in state structures. It influenced budgets, education, media, and identity. By 1914, Europe's armies were not merely prepared. They were eager. Eager not necessarily for bloodshed, but for validation. For proof that years of training and planning mattered. War was expected to be decisive. Few imagined it would become static and attritional. Few imagined trenches stretching across continents. Few imagined millions dead. The cult of the offensive thrived on belief in speed and honor. It would collide brutally with industrial reality. As the Balkan region simmered and alliance blocks hardened, the militarized mindset meant that any spark would ignite rapid escalation. Mobilization plans were set. Doctrines fixed. Pride entrenched. Europe had not stumbled blindly into danger. It had marched toward it, boots polished, bands playing, convinced that strength guaranteed security. The uniforms still gleamed in summer sunlight. But beneath that gleam lay steel, and beneath the steel, powder. All it required was one moment to set the machinery in motion. Chapter 12. Nationalism. The fire beneath the surface. The cheers began long before the shots were fired. They rose from classrooms, from cafes, from crowded parliament halls and quiet village squares. They rose in different languages, under different flags, but they carried the same message. We are a nation, and we deserve our place. By the early 20th century, nationalism was not a fringe idea. It was the emotional engine of Europe. It pulsed beneath politics, beneath diplomacy, beneath military planning. And once that engine overheated, it would be impossible to cool. Nationalism had helped unify Germany in 1871. It had strengthened France after humiliation. It had fueled Italian unification decades earlier. It had given voice to peoples long ruled by empires. At its birth, nationalism was often framed as liberation, the right of a people who shared language, culture, and history to govern themselves. But by 1914, nationalism had evolved into something sharper. In Germany, pride surged after unification. The empire was young, industrial, confident. Steel production soared. Universities led the world in science. Military victories were part of living memory. Children recited patriotic verses. Maps in classrooms displayed colonies across Africa and the Pacific. The German nation was not just a political entity. It was a symbol of destiny. France carried a different kind of nationalism, one forged in defeat. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1871 was more than territorial. It was emotional. School children were taught to remember. Veterans spoke of Sedan in hushed, bitter tones. The provinces were depicted in mourning colors on maps. The phrase revanche, revenge, lingered in public discourse. French nationalism was wounded, and wounds often burn longer than triumphs. In Britain, nationalism intertwined with empire. The sun never set on British possessions. Ships sailed from London to India, to Canada, to Australia. The Royal Navy was not just a military instrument. It was a symbol of British supremacy. The empire's reach fostered confidence and anxiety. Any challenge to naval dominance felt like a threat to national survival. Russia's nationalism carried yet another form. It was imperial and Slavic at once. The Tsar ruled over dozens of ethnic groups, yet Russian identity was promoted as central and superior. Panslavism, the idea that Slavic peoples shared a common destiny, gained traction, especially in the Balkans. Serbia, seen as a fellow Slavic state, became emotionally significant to Russian nationalists. Austria-Hungary struggled most with nationalism. It was not a unified nation-state, but a multinational empire. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, each carried its own language and historical memory. Nationalist movements within the empire demanded autonomy, recognition, or independence. Vienna relied on tradition, monarchy, and military authority to hold the patchwork together. The Balkans became the crucible of nationalist fire. Serbia, small but ambitious, emerged from the Balkan Wars stronger and more confident. Its dream of uniting South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, under one state grew louder. To Serbian nationalists, Austria-Hungary's control of Bosnia was an affront. It kept fellow Slavs under foreign rule. Secret societies formed. One of the most notorious was the Black Hand, officially known as Unification or Death. Its members swore oaths in dimly lit rooms, the air heavy with candle smoke and whispered vows. They believed violence was justified if it advanced national unity. Assassination was not murder in their eyes. It was liberation. Austria-Hungary viewed these developments with dread. The empire's leaders understood that nationalism could tear them apart. If Serbia succeeded in uniting Slavs outside its borders, Slavs within the empire might follow. Nationalism, once unleashed, did not respect imperial boundaries. The emotional intensity of nationalism altered politics everywhere. Newspapers amplified patriotic rhetoric. Politicians gained popularity by defending national honor. Military parades were cheered not just as displays of power, but as affirmations of identity. National pride became intertwined with foreign policy. When Germany challenged France and Morocco, it was not only about colonial influence. It was about respect. When Austria annexed Bosnia, it was not only about administration. It was about prestige and security. Each crisis became a test of national dignity. This dynamic reduced room for compromise. In earlier decades, diplomats might quietly adjust borders or influence without inflaming public opinion. By 1914, newspapers reached millions daily. Public debate was immediate and loud. Leaders feared appearing weak. Nationalism also reshaped the meaning of alliances. France did not support Russia merely out of strategic calculation. It saw Russia as a partner against German dominance. Russia supported Serbia not only for geopolitical gain, but because Slavic solidarity resonated deeply. Britain's growing alignment with France was influenced not just by naval calculations, but by a sense of shared civilization against perceived German aggression. National narratives hardened. Germany felt encircled and misunderstood. A rising power denied its rightful place. France felt determined to reclaim honor. Russia felt protective of Slavs and resentful of past humiliations. Austria-Hungary felt threatened by internal fragmentation. Britain felt obligated to defend its maritime supremacy. Each nation saw itself as justified, and nationalism made those justifications moral, even sacred. The atmosphere in European capitals reflected this mood. In Berlin, patriotic songs filled beer halls. In Paris, veterans associations marched annually to commemorate past sacrifices. In Belgrade, speeches about unification drew roaring applause. In Vienna, imperial ceremonies attempted to reinforce loyalty amid diversity. The cult of the nation overshadowed the concept of shared European identity. Industrialization and education spread nationalist ideas rapidly. Literacy rates climbed. Printed materials circulated widely. Citizens who once identified primarily with local regions now embraced national symbols. Flags mattered more. Anthems stirred deeper emotion. Nationalism also intersected with militarism. If the nation was sacred, then defending it justified sacrifice. If the nation was threatened, mobilization became a duty. The cult of the offensive, already powerful in military doctrine, found fertile ground in nationalist enthusiasm. Young men volunteered eagerly. They believed they were defending more than territory. They were defending identity. The Balkan Wars intensified this belief. Serbia's victories seemed proof that nationalism could reshape borders. Bulgaria's defeat fueled resentment. Greece's expansion strengthened pride. Each outcome reinforced the idea that nations must fight for destiny. Austria-Hungary saw Serbia not merely as a rival state, but as an ideological threat. Russia saw Austria not merely as a neighbor, but as an oppressor of Slavs. Nationalism transformed local disputes into existential struggles. It narrowed leaders' options. Compromise could be portrayed as betrayal. Diplomacy could be labeled weakness. Political opponents exploited nationalist sentiment to undermine moderation. In Germany, nationalist groups criticized any perceived concession. In France, right-wing leagues demanded firmness. In Russia, Pan-Slavists pressured the government to defend Serbia more aggressively. The emotional temperature rose steadily. By 1914, nationalism was not a policy tool. It was a force. It influenced how crises were interpreted. It colored intelligence assessments. It shaped public reaction. When the Bosnian crisis erupted in 1908, Serbia's outrage was nationalist at its core. When the Balkan Wars unfolded, they were fought in the name of national liberation. And within Bosnia itself, nationalist resentment simmered. Sarajevo, a city of mingled cultures and faiths, felt the tension acutely. Austro-Hungarian officials administered daily affairs. Serbian nationalists whispered about liberation. The streets smelled of roasted coffee and damp stone. Life appeared ordinary, yet beneath it lay radical ideas. Nationalism did not guarantee war, but it ensured that if war came, it would be embraced by many as righteous. The alliance blocs had formed. The militaries had prepared. The imperial rivalries had sharpened. Nationalism provided the emotional fuel. It ensured that when leaders made decisions in crisis, they would not be guided solely by cold calculation. They would feel the weight of public expectation, of honor, of destiny. And destiny, once invoked, is difficult to restrain. The fire beneath Europe's surface was now burning steadily. It needed only a spark. Chapter 13. The July Crisis. The morning sun rose over Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets still damp from the previous night's rain. Church bells rang faintly in the distance. Vendors arranged fruit in neat rows. The air carried the scent of coffee and dust. It felt like an ordinary summer Sunday. It was not. The motorcade moved slowly through the city, open-topped cars gliding past curious crowds. Inside one of them sat Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. His uniform was immaculate, medals pinned carefully across his chest. Beside him sat his wife, Sophie, elegant and composed. They had come to inspect imperial troops and display imperial authority in a province whose loyalty was never fully secure. They did not know that several young men were waiting along their route. The first bomb thrown that morning missed its target, bouncing off the Archduke's car and exploding beneath the vehicle behind it. The blast tore through metal and flesh. The smell of smoke and blood filled the air. Screams echoed off stone buildings. The motorcade sped away. For a moment, it seemed the danger had passed. Later that morning, as the Archduke's car took a wrong turn and slowed to reverse, a young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward. He raised a pistol. 2 shots cracked sharply through the summer air. One struck Sophie. The other pierced the Archduke's neck. Witnesses later described the surreal silence that followed, the stunned stillness before panic erupted. Blood soaked into fabric. Franz Ferdinand slumped forward, whispering to his wife, "Don't die." Within minutes, both were dead. The assassination was shocking, but not unprecedented. Political violence had marked Europe before. What made this moment different was what followed. In Vienna, news of the assassination spread quickly through imperial halls. The air inside government offices felt heavy with disbelief. Some officials reacted with fury, others with cold calculation. Franz Ferdinand had not been universally popular within the empire, yet his murder by a Slavic nationalist carried symbolic weight. It felt like an attack not just on a man, but on imperial authority itself. Austria-Hungary faced a choice. It could treat the assassination as a criminal act, pursuing justice through investigation and limited retaliation. Or it could treat it as an opportunity to crush Serbia, which it blamed for fostering nationalist agitation. The latter path gained momentum. Evidence soon pointed to connections between the assassins and elements within Serbian military intelligence, particularly the Black Hand Society. Though the Serbian government itself was not directly implicated, the distinction blurred in Vienna's view. Within days, Austria-Hungary began consulting its most powerful ally. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors expressed unwavering support for Vienna. Germany issued what would later be known as the blank check, a promise to back Austria-Hungary even if action against Serbia triggered Russian intervention. This assurance was pivotal. With Germany's backing secured, Austria-Hungary drafted an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so severe that acceptance seemed unlikely. It required Serbia to suppress nationalist groups, remove certain officials, and allow Austro-Hungarian investigators to operate on Serbian soil. The ultimatum was delivered on July 23. In Belgrade, Serbian leaders read the document with grim faces. The terms struck at their sovereignty, yet they knew rejection could mean war. For 48 tense hours, the air across Europe felt charged. Diplomats hurried between embassies. Telegraph lines buzzed. Newspapers speculated wildly. Serbia's response was conciliatory. It accepted most demands but rejected those that compromised its judicial independence. It offered to submit disputes to international arbitration. In another era, this might have sufficed. In Vienna, hardliners were unmoved. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first artillery shells fell on Belgrade. Smoke rose above the Danube. Civilians fled streets that only days earlier had been calm. The Balkan fault line had erupted again. But this time, the alliances loomed large. Russia, protector of Serbia and bound by Slavic solidarity, faced immense pressure to respond. Public opinion demanded action. Military leaders warned that failure to support Serbia would diminish Russia's credibility permanently. Partial mobilization was ordered. In the rigid logic of early 20th century war planning, mobilization was nearly synonymous with war. Germany's military doctrine assumed that if Russia mobilized, France would follow. And Germany could not afford to wait. In Berlin, debates unfolded feverishly. Could mobilization be halted? Could diplomacy intervene? The machinery of alliance and militarism pressed forward. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, it declared war on France. The Schlieffen Plan activated. German troops crossed into Belgium, neutral territory guaranteed by international treaty. Railways thundered with movement. Soldiers marched westward in disciplined columns, boots striking pavement in unison. Belgium resisted fiercely. Towns like Liège saw brutal fighting. The smell of gunpowder and burning timber filled the air. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality and aligned increasingly with France, faced its decision. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. In just over a month, a regional assassination had escalated into a continental war. The July crisis revealed how fragile Europe's peace had become. Each leader believed he was acting defensively. Austria-Hungary sought to punish Serbia to preserve imperial authority. Germany sought to support its ally and avoid encirclement. Russia sought to defend Slavic solidarity. France honored alliance commitments. Britain defended treaty obligations and strategic balance. No single power intended a world war. Yet the interconnected alliance system, rigid mobilization timetables, nationalist fervor, and militarized thinking transformed crisis into catastrophe. The atmosphere in European capitals during those final days of July was electric and surreal. Crowds gathered in city squares, cheering mobilization announcements. Bands played patriotic songs. Young men volunteered eagerly. The smell of summer flowers mixed with the scent of uniforms freshly issued. Many believed the war would be short. They imagined decisive battles, quick victories, triumphant returns. Few imagined trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Few imagined industrial slaughter on a scale never before seen. The July crisis was not inevitable in its specific details. Diplomacy might have intervened. Ultimatums might have been softened. Mobilization might have been delayed. But the underlying conditions, alliance blocs, militarism, nationalism, imperial rivalry, made escalation increasingly likely. The assassination in Sarajevo was the spark. The structure of Europe was the tinder. As August dawned, trains carried millions of soldiers toward borders. Families waved farewell on crowded platforms. Letters were written in hurried script. The machinery that had been built over decades now moved with unstoppable momentum. The calm summer morning in Sarajevo had shattered a continent, and the war that many believed would last weeks would stretch into years, reshaping the world far beyond Europe's borders. The July crisis was over. The Great War had begun. Chapter 14. The first shots of the Great War. The first shells did not sound like destiny. They sounded like distant thunder rolling across the Danube. On the night of July 28, 1914, Austro-Hungarian artillery opened fire on Belgrade. The flashes lit up the riverbanks in brief, violent bursts. Windows shattered. Civilians stumbled through smoke-filled streets, clutching children and bundles of belongings. It was the beginning of what Europe had spent decades preparing for and desperately hoping to avoid. Yet in those first hours, few grasped the scale of what was unfolding. In Vienna, officials framed the bombardment as a limited punitive action against Serbia. In Berlin, there was confidence that swift mobilization would secure victory before Russia could fully respond. In St. Petersburg, mobilization orders rolled outward through rail depots and military districts. Heavy boots echoing across wooden platforms as reservists boarded trains heading west. The machinery of war, constructed piece by piece over 40 years, had begun to move. The alliance blocs hardened into reality. Austria-Hungary at war with Serbia. Russia mobilizing in defense of Serbia. Germany, committed to supporting Vienna, declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, bound by alliance, began its own mobilization. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The Schlieffen Plan activated with ruthless precision. The logic was cold and mathematical. Defeat France quickly through a massive right-wing sweep through Belgium, then turn east to face Russia. Speed was everything. The plan assumed that Russian mobilization would be slow, that France would be crushed in weeks. German railways thundered day and night. Thousands of trains transported troops, horses, artillery, and ammunition toward the western frontier. Soldiers leaned out of carriage windows waving caps and singing patriotic songs. The air smelled of coal smoke and anticipation. They believed they would be home by Christmas. In Belgium, the mood was different. The kingdom had declared neutrality. Its government trusted in treaties guaranteeing its sovereignty. When German forces crossed the border on August 4th, Belgian resistance was immediate and fierce. Fortresses at Liège held out stubbornly against overwhelming force. The crack of rifles and the roar of heavy artillery shattered the summer stillness. Belgian civilians watched in disbelief as the war they had not chosen engulfed them. Britain now faced its decision. The violation of Belgian neutrality struck at both legal obligation and strategic necessity. British policymakers understood that if Germany dominated the Channel coast, it would threaten Britain's security directly. On the evening of August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The war that began with artillery fire on the Danube now stretched from London to Moscow. In Paris, crowds gathered beneath tricolor flags. Mobilization posters were plastered across walls. Men kissed wives goodbye beneath railway station clocks. The smell of perfume mingled with the metallic scent of fear. Plan 17 called for an offensive into Alsace-Lorraine, reclaiming territory lost in 1871. French troops advanced with red trousers and blue coats gleaming under sunlight, bayonets fixed, believing courage would carry them through. They would soon discover the reality of modern firepower. Machine guns tore through advancing lines. Artillery shells exploded with devastating force. The fields of Lorraine and the Ardennes became killing grounds. Smoke hung low over wheat fields trampled by boots and stained with blood. In the east, Russian armies moved faster than German planners expected. Within weeks, they invaded East Prussia. German civilians fled in panic, carts loaded with belongings creaking along dusty roads. Churches rang alarm bells. Fear gripped border towns. The German high command faced a dilemma: divert forces east to stop Russia, or maintain the full weight of the Schlieffen offensive in the west. They chose to shift troops eastward. At the Battle of Tannenberg in late August, German forces encircled and destroyed a Russian army in a stunning victory. The smell of powder and sweat lingered over lakes and forests as thousands of Russian soldiers were captured. The triumph boosted German morale, but it did not end the war in the west. In France, the German advance pressed toward Paris. Columns of soldiers marched relentlessly. Villages burned. Civilians fled with what they could carry. The sound of boots and artillery never seemed to stop. By early September, German forces approached the outskirts of the French capital. Panic rippled through the city. Government offices prepared for evacuation. Taxi drivers famously transported soldiers to the front in a desperate attempt to reinforce defensive lines. Then came the Battle of the Marne. French and British forces counterattacked fiercely. The gap in German lines was exploited. The advance stalled. The German right wing began to retreat. The dream of a quick victory evaporated. Both sides dug into the earth. Trenches stretched across northern France like scars carved into the land. Barbed wire glinted in the sun. Mud-filled boots. Rats scurried through narrow corridors of sandbags and timber supports. The smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies became constant companions. The war did not end in weeks. It settled into stalemate. In the east, fighting remained fluid, with vast spaces and shifting lines. Austria-Hungary struggled against Serbian resistance in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in late 1914, expanding the conflict into the Middle East. The war was no longer European. It was global. Colonial troops from India, Africa, Australia, and Canada began arriving in Europe. Battles erupted in Africa and the Pacific. Naval engagements occurred in distant seas. The scale of mobilization was unprecedented. Millions of men were under arms. Factories converted to wartime production. Women filled industrial jobs vacated by soldiers. Railways operated without pause. The smell of coal smoke thickened over cities. Yet amid industrial coordination, human suffering mounted rapidly. Casualties in the first months were staggering. Entire regiments were decimated. Hospitals overflowed. Letters home described horror beyond imagination. The cult of the offensive collided with machine gun reality. Leaders who had predicted a short war now faced prolonged slaughter. But retreat was politically impossible. National pride demanded perseverance. Alliance commitments required solidarity. Militarism discouraged compromise. The first shots on the Danube had triggered a cascade no one could halt. In London, Berlin, Paris, and St. Petersburg, governments mobilized economies for total war. Censorship tightened. Propaganda flourished. The language of destiny intensified. The illusion of a limited Balkan War vanished entirely. The First World War, though not yet named as such, had become a continental inferno. The speed of escalation during the July crisis had given way to grinding attrition. Soldiers who marched confidently in August now crouched in muddy trenches by winter. Snow fell on shattered landscapes. Frostbite and dysentery joined bullets as enemies. Yet still, leaders believed victory was possible. Austria-Hungary sought to crush Serbia. Germany aimed to break France and withstand Russia. France fought for survival and honor. Britain fought to maintain balance and defend its empire. Russia fought for Slavic solidarity and imperial prestige. Each nation framed its cause as just. Each believed sacrifice was necessary. The first shots had been fired. The war they ignited would reshape borders, topple empires, and alter the course of the 20th century. But in those early months, as trenches hardened and casualty lists lengthened, the world still did not fully grasp the scale of transformation underway. The machinery of alliances, nationalism, and militarism had done its work. Europe had marched into the abyss, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 15. The Point of No Return. By the winter of 1914, the cheering had faded. The banners still hung in city squares, but they were damp now, heavy with rain and soot. The brass bands were quieter. The parades had given way to casualty lists pinned to bulletin boards outside government offices. Europe had not collapsed in a single dramatic explosion. It had slid, step by step, across a threshold it could no longer recross. The point of no return was not a date circled in red ink. It was a realization, slow, dawning, undeniable, that the war begun in a Balkan street had become something larger than any government had intended, and that the forces unleashed between 1870 and 1914 could not be unwound. By December, the Western Front had solidified into a scar stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Soldiers who had marched confidently in summer now crouched beneath frozen earthworks, water-pooled in trenches. The smell of damp wool and cordite clung to everything. Boots sank into mud thick as glue. The war had stopped moving, but it had not stopped killing. This was not the war Europe's leaders had envisioned. The Schlieffen Plan had failed to deliver swift victory. France had not collapsed. Russia, though battered at Tannenberg, remained in the field. Britain had committed its expeditionary force. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war. Japan had seized German possessions in the Pacific. The conflict was expanding geographically even as it stagnated tactically. The machinery built over 4 decades was now grinding relentlessly. Factories in the Ruhr roared day and night, forging shells and rifles. French industrial cities worked without pause. British shipyards clanged with activity. Russian railways strained under the weight of mobilization. The war was no longer merely military. It was industrial, economic, societal, and none of it could be reversed easily. Diplomacy, once flexible and improvisational, was gone. The alliance blocs that had formed gradually since the 1880s now functioned as iron bonds. Germany could not abandon Austria-Hungary without destroying its credibility. France could not leave Russia exposed without unraveling its own security. Britain could not permit German dominance on the continent without jeopardizing its empire. Every government feared that negotiation would look like weakness. Nationalism ensured that public opinion would not tolerate compromise. Newspapers framed each battle as a test of honor. Propaganda posters depicted enemies as monsters. Children collected donations for soldiers. Women sewed uniforms and bandages. The war had entered homes and hearts. The point of no return was psychological as much as strategic. In Berlin, officials who once debated the risks of encirclement now faced reality. They were encircled, and they would fight through it. In Paris, leaders who had once hoped to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine quickly now braced for a long struggle. In London, policymakers who had hesitated about continental entanglement now prepared for total commitment. The war had become existential. The assassination in Sarajevo had been the spark, but the fire it ignited consumed structures built over decades. Militarism, nationalism, imperial rivalry, alliance rigidity. In Vienna, the Habsburg Empire had sought to assert authority over Serbia. Instead, it found itself embroiled in a war that would strain its fragile unity beyond endurance. In St. Petersburg, Russia had mobilized to defend Slavic prestige. It now faced staggering casualties and logistical challenges. The first Christmas of the war arrived under a gray sky. In some sectors of the Western Front, soldiers emerged cautiously from trenches and exchanged small gifts in an unofficial truce. The smell of tobacco drifted across no man's land. Carols were sung in multiple languages. For a brief moment, humanity pierced the machinery, but the truce ended quickly. Commanders feared fraternization. Orders resumed. The guns roared again. The illusion of a short war was shattered. Mobilization plans had assumed weeks, not years. Economic reserves had been calculated for campaigns, not prolonged attrition. Yet none of the powers could disengage without catastrophic loss of face and territory. The logic of the pre-war decades, the belief that strength and swift action would guarantee security, had led them here. Germany had built alliances to avoid isolation. France had sought partners to counter humiliation. Britain had expanded its navy to preserve supremacy. Russia had embraced Slavic solidarity. Austria-Hungary had tried to suppress nationalism within its borders. Each decision had seemed rational at the time. Together, they formed a chain reaction. By early 1915, the war lines hardened further. New fronts opened. The Gallipoli campaign targeted the Ottoman Empire. Fighting intensified in the east. Italy, once part of the Triple Alliance, would soon enter the war on the side of the Entente, reshaping alliances yet again. The conflict was evolving beyond any original calculation. But the point of no return had already passed in July and August of 1914, when mobilization timetables overruled diplomacy, when alliance commitments overrode caution, when national pride outweighed compromise. The years between 1870 and 1914 had not been peaceful in spirit. They had been a prolonged preparation, diplomatic, psychological, military. The Franco-Prussian War had planted seeds of revenge and confidence. Bismarck's web had held tension temporarily. The fall of restraint under Wilhelm had hardened rivalries. The scramble for empire had expanded competition. Naval arms races had deepened suspicion. Alliance blocs had solidified. Moroccan crises had tested resolve. Balkan conflicts had inflamed nationalism. Militarism had shaped doctrine. The July crisis had activated the machine. By the time the first shots were fired, the structure was already primed for collapse. The tragedy was not that Europe stumbled blindly. It was that it moved knowingly into danger, believing control was still possible. Leaders believed they could localize conflict. They believed mobilization would deter rather than ignite. They believed alliances would preserve balance. Instead, those same mechanisms ensured escalation. The point of no return was reached not when war began, but when no leader felt able to stop it. In the trenches, soldiers rarely contemplated the diplomatic intricacies of previous decades. They felt cold, hunger, fear, the vibration of artillery through their bones, the taste of metal in the air after bombardment. Yet their suffering was the product of 40 years of accumulation. The war that had begun as a punitive strike against Serbia now consumed continents. Empires that had seemed permanent, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman, would not survive intact. The balance of power carefully managed since the Congress of Vienna would be shattered, and the peace that would follow would carry its own seeds of instability. But in the winter of 1914, none of that was fully visible. What was visible were endless lines of trenches, columns of smoke rising from shattered villages, hospital wards filled with wounded men, and governments determined to continue. The wars that made the First World War inevitable had done their work. From 1870 onward, each rivalry, each alliance, each crisis had tightened the spiral. When the final turn came, there was no room left for retreat. Europe had crossed its threshold, and the world would never be the same again.